Each year, my town selects someone to be a superhero. The choice used to be made at random, a sort of lottery situation, but there were suspicions that this was rigged. The names drawn always belonging to the more aristocratic families of our humble and secluded town. Rather than be exposed and risk societal upheaval, or worse, the governance of the town, positions occupied by many of the aforementioned family decided on a new process of selection: merit. As before, anyone was eligible to be drawn, as long as they hadn't committed any serious crimes against the town or its citizens. But with this new process, everyone was at last truly eligible, given proper weighted consideration rather than perfunctory acknowledgement. All one had to do was offer up an example or examples of merit, during which he or she displayed, performed, or exemplified some universally valued trait or effort. This, it was said during the announcement of the decision, was what being a superhero was all about anyway. Mere citizenship wasn't enough. The annual protector of the town should embody not just the spirit of the town, but its best values as well. Having just graduated my town's equivalent of high school, I had the availability of time to really think about what I might have done in life to warrant a selection. Neither my mother nor my father cared about the selection. They were both content with the undeniably heroic duty of parenting, and my younger brother echoed their opinions, mostly owed to his belief that by being superheroes, they would face extreme danger. It was partly true. As superheroes, they would be given the duty of defending the town for a full year. Rarely did those who were selected ever needed to considerably use their powers, but the need occasionally arose, typically at the tail end of their term. At the end of their term, the very last month of it, supervillains are legalized. Unlike the superheroes, supervillains are not declared or empowered by the town's government. They must come about their own abilities, which rarely amount to anything harmful to the superheroes, who are given truly superhuman powers. The powers, without revealing too much about my town and our secrets, are derived from the dust of a certain ore. When mixed with water, the admixture can, in small doses, provide one with enhancements to every facet of their physical being. The process is a bit more complicated than that, and certain other steps must be taken in preparation, but that is the simplified answer to how the powers are given. The allowance of an opposing supervillain is mainly an option for anyone who protests the selection of the hero, or the perception that the hero hadn't adequately performed the duties required of them. The villain, rarely ever super, may commit any acts of violence against the hero, the town, and its people, although by doing so they waive the right to citizenship and due process. Its legalization is purely for the zealous, who feel without a doubt that the hero has failed the town. I hadn't had any enemies in school nor generally about town, so if I were selected, I didn't fear any opposition in the last month. I told a few friends that I planned on proposing myself for selection, and most of them expressed open support for me, or they wished me luck, since they would be proposing themselves as well. I did a lot of tutoring throughout school, and it helped a lot of students pass their classes and advance in grade levels, so I decided to use that as my example of my meritorious worth. When the selection day came, I stood before the town on the podium at the city center and spoke passionately about what I had done. The end of my speech was met with high praise, and the town's 3 mayors even seemed swayed by my words. Once all of the candidates made their speeches, the mayors convened in their offices to determine the person selected. I wouldn't say I was shocked when they returned to the stage and they called out my name, but I was definitely elate. I sprang up and nearly fell face first onto the steps, barely managing to catch myself, It was an embarrassing start to a year-long duty of heroism, but I didn't care. I was going to become a superhero. My acceptance speech was riddled with stuttering and nervous laughter, but everyone seemed to at least find it endearing. I thanked the people who had shown support for me and promised that I would do absolutely anything for my town. I was then led off stage, and while the rest of the town prepared for the selection festival, so that no one went home feeling upset or indignant, I was taken to the mines just outside of town. The infusion, as they called it, was to happen at once, so that I could display my abilities before the gathered townsfolk at the final hour of the festival. I had no problems with this. I was excited to be given my powers, as anyone in my position would be. During the drive there, the mayors advised me of certain foreseeable potentialities regarding the infusion process. Apparently, the process was somewhat taxing on the body, and a few people had physiologically rejected the process, their genetic makeup somehow incompatible. I was assured that this was extremely rare and that I needn't worry, since I was a young, good-hearted boy. I didn't question what exactly they meant by good-hearted, but assumed that it was in reference to my character. But what if that were the case? What impact would it have upon my body's acceptance of the superpower agent? I was led to the mouth of the mines and told to wait. The mayors then left, leaving me in the custody of the miners. One of them left to fetch the dust, which was kept within the heavily guarded mine. In the 30 years since the dust was discovered, no one had dared to try and steal some, but it was nonetheless ceaselessly attended. The miner soon returned, carrying a glass jar with a wax-sealed lid, the purplish dust clearly visible within. It didn't look very special, the consistency of sand, but the man carried it with a simultaneous caution and dignity that bespoke of its true power. A small scoop, much smaller than I would have expected, of the contents was lifted from the jar and placed within a small cup held by another miner. They used what vaguely resembled a coffee stirrer to mix the solution, turning the water a deep purple. A few other things were done, rites that were ceremonially but not technically necessary, and I watched these performed with the giddiness of a child who had just been promised a new toy. When the rites were completed, I was given the cup and told to drink fully of its contents. Had I not been so excited, I probably would have spat this stuff out. It tasted vile, like what I would imagine urine left in a toilet for days would taste like. Its effects, however, were immediate and wonderful. I felt a sudden and incredible invigoration, a strengthening of not just my muscles and tendons, but of my bones and even my organs. Everything felt newly, powerfully fortified. It was as if I had been crippled and debilitated my entire life, and it was only now being restored to a proper bodily state. Not to sound narcissistic or self-aggrandizing, but I felt immediately certainly superior to the men around me, even though they appeared physically stronger. The miners told me that in addition to the enhancement of my physical prowess, I could also select a secondary trait. I was given a choice of what would simply be called teleportation, the atomic deconstruction and reconstruction of my body, wherever I mentally projected myself. They said this was as painful as it might sound, but that it was incredibly useful. I could relocate wherever I could imagine, arriving at an active crime scene instantaneously. The next option was night vision, a rather mundane ability, but one that was useful for night patrols, which I was required to perform. The third and final option, the one that I chose, was telepathy. I would be able to receive and even transmit words and mental images. The miners explained that my telepathic reception was highly empathic. I would be able to receive the mental states and sometimes even the actual thoughts of people without their knowledge. The clear invasion of privacy was dismissed by the men due to the importance of the ability in the combat of crime. Knowing when and how a crime would be committed was to the benefit of the community. Since I had lived my life under the security of teachers and parents, I was elated to have the opportunity to turn the tides. I should have instead understood the importance of one's privacy, since mine had been routinely infringed upon as a child and student. But my thoughts were clearly self-centered, and the decision to accept the telepathic gift eventually led to the most disastrous and horrifying event of my life. I was imbued with the telepathic ability by means of a differently colored dust, which the miner had gone back into the mine to fetch, bringing the original jar with him. They never brought more than one jar out at a time, in case someone trespassed upon the ceremony and tried to steal the jar. When the miner returned, he carried a jar filled with pinkish dust, and he and his associate again mixed a spoonful with water and performed the requested rites. I was passed the cup and drank of the liquid, which tasted slightly less awful. The pea-like taste not as acrid. The men then told me to return to the festival, where I was to perform a few feats of strength before the awaiting crowd. I had originally arrived by car, the mines being several miles from the town, but with my new abilities, they said it would be faster if I ran. I asked out of simple curiosity if they had ever attended the festival. It was an incredibly fun event, and someone of their important station deserved to enjoy themselves every once in a while. They exchanged a glance that said more than I could have interpreted, although their shared demeanor suggested that my knowledge of their duties was fairly incomplete. We don't just watch the dust in there, kid. There are other things that must be kept secure. His tone was unmistakably ominous, and his smile suggested that I drop the matter and leave. I briefly considered testing out my psychic abilities then, to try and discern what exactly they were guarding, hiding beyond the dust. But I decided not to. These were respectable men just performing their duty. I did, however, receive certain intimations, not from the miners, but from beyond them, within the mine itself. These vague messages weren't thoughts or anything similarly definite, just feelings, bursts of emotion. Whatever was held within those cavernous confines seemed angry, as if it had been imprisoned. Ordinarily, I would have felt heroically compelled to inquire about this suspected prisoner, but I was suddenly given the impression that its confinement was necessary, that it should not be allowed its freedom, that it was something sinister, locked away for the safety of the town. My mental connection with the entity started to unsettle me, and so I forced myself to ignore it and turned my attention back to the miners. I thanked them for the wonderful gifts and I wished them well on their work, and then I headed to the festival. Once arrived, I was intercepted by my younger brother, who had waited just outside of the mining territory. He was teary-eyed and hugged me tighter than he'd ever done before. I asked him what was wrong, and he said that he didn't want me to get hurt, didn't want a supervillain to destroy me. I assured him that I would be fine, that no one in town hated me, and that I would perform my duties well enough for everyone to be satisfied. I also felt, but did not say so, that there wasn't a single person in the town who could possibly harm me in any way. I felt like a god, indomitable, invincible, beyond the middling capabilities of regular men. I hadn't forgotten about the thing that dwelt within the depths of the mind, and though it unsettled me, I was sure that the miners were perfectly capable of watching over it. The showcase of my abilities went well. I lifted all 3 mares in their seats, which greatly amused the townsfolk. I lifted a fire truck, present in case of emergency, and even withstood a gunshot to the chest, something that I urged an officer to do, and which was done begrudgingly and apologetically. The bullet felt no worse than a poke, and I would have allowed for a veritable firing squad, if my mother hadn't sent a death-eyed glare at the chief of police. The festival concluded and everyone returned home. I was given my list of duties by the mayors and the police, with whom I would work with in maintaining the safety and order of the town. Our town's population is small, but its land is widespread, and the number of officers overseeing its safety is very small compared to other towns of our size, hence the employment of superpowered assistants. We've had 41 superheroes conduct annual watches over the city. All of them but one had carried out their full terms, and their powers diminished shortly after. Only one had ended his term prematurely. As I had, he had chosen telepathy, and through his abilities found out that his wife was not only cheating on him, but had cheated in the past. The boy that he had raised was not his biological son. On a cold night decades ago, this hero seized his wife and flew her into the sky. He lost consciousness shortly after achieving a considerably high altitude, and they both then plummeted to their deaths. The physical enhancements of the dust are limited. A fall from such height would kill anyone, superhuman or not. I had no reason to believe that my term would end prematurely, and it seemed outright impossible that it would end so morbidly. But not only did it end on the very first night of my duties, it ended horribly, with an outcome full of agony and terror. For my first night, I was tasked with patrolling the streets, ensuring that everyone arrived home safely, and that any intoxicated drivers, plenty of drinking at the festival, were detained and taken to jail to sober up overnight. This sounded easy enough, especially since I was given a list of the usual suspects to watch out for. I even felt kind of disappointed. I had all of this power, and it at most would be used to slowly bring a car to a stop. The first hour was uneventful. Everyone was being annoyingly responsible. When wandering the streets became too dull, I started climbing buildings, but this quickly became boring as well. There aren't any skyscrapers in our town. The hours passed by slowly, the tedium of the patrol almost unbearable. I wanted something to happen, some inaugural crime to really make me feel heroic. But nothing came. So I eventually tapped into my second ability and psychically listened to see if I could at least hear something of interest. And boy did I. If I would have allowed the night to end normally, peacefully, I might have retained my powers, and probably would have gone on to be a commendable protector of the town. But I was bored, overconfident, and inconsiderate. A cocktail of foolishness that led to my undoing. I allowed my telepathic receptors, whatever they were, to tune into the world around me, and I eventually picked up some rather hostile thoughts from a man sitting in his car at a stoplight. From what I gathered, he strongly, fiercely believed that the selection of superheroes should have gone to his daughter, who, in his unspoken words, was a young beacon of justice. I had never met his daughter, so I couldn't give any credence to his beliefs. But I was pretty confident that I had done more for our town than she had, even though I knew nothing of her societal accomplishments. The man's anger rose with each second, and seemed partially fueled by the noticeably prolonged red light. Bored, self-assured, and unquestionably immature, an observation of hindsight, I decided to interact with him. I leapt from the building on which I was perched, and landed just in front of his car. My impact shook the ground and rocked his vehicle. He looked startled, but the anger that he felt soon overtook his shocked expression, and I saw his knuckles turn white as he gripped his steering wheel. I smiled and waved, knowing that in doing so, I would only anger him further. His furrowed brows confirmed my expectations, and I widened my crap-eating grin. I expected him to floor the pedal and try to ram me, which I would have survived without question. But to my genuine surprise, he exited his vehicle. I greeted him politely, Although being fresh out of high school, I had yet to master the feigned sincerity that adults utilize with ease. He saw through it and asked what I wanted, not bothering to withhold the contempt from his voice. I asked what he was doing out so late at night, an hour past midnight, and if he needed assistance in navigating home. I barely bothered with trying to sound earnest, the smugness obvious in my tone. It was at this point that things went south. The man smiled in response to my BS offer for assistance, which caught me off guard. He said that he had just been out for a late night drive because it was a nice, breezy night. It was. I politely but firmly said that he should head on home, suggesting with my tone that a curfew was in place, even though our town had no such thing. He agreed, but he said that he wanted to show me something, a gift of congratulations for being selected. I sensed something off about his behavior, and suspected that his gift would in fact turn out to be a weapon or an object of intended harm. He reached into his car, opened the glove box, and pulled out a glass jar. The jar looked extremely similar to those that had contained the empowering powder from the mines. I felt myself tensing up, thinking that this man had somehow obtained the power-activating dust. He held the jar up, admiring it, but did not reach for the wax-sealed cap. If he had, I would have charged at him and snatched the jar away before he could perform a single twist. He looked up from the jar and then spoke in a level, though grave tone, meeting my inhumanly magnified gaze as he did so. I was 6 when it happened. 6 years old. I was woken up by the shouting and the screaming, and of course, the roof of my house being destroyed. I actually watched them fly up into the clouds. Thankfully, they had flown at an angle. They fell about a mile away from the house. I was told that they landed together, that my mother had still been wrapped in his arms, although the distinction between his body and hers was a bit hard to tell at first, both being reduced to a sort of mush on impact. When the police eventually came to check on me and told me what had happened, I swore to myself that I would never, ever forgive either of them. He paused to wipe away his tears and then continued. I wasn't going to forgive my mother for the lies, for making me call a stranger dad. And I wasn't going to forgive my father for doing that to my mother. I swore another thing too, that I would never forgive my real, biological father for not coming to see me, for not acknowledging me as his son at all. I held on to these feelings even as I aged and became a father myself. The hate, anger, they had almost died, had subsided quite a bit. But then I saw you on that stage, and when you were selected, it all came back again. Do you know why? I shook my head, genuinely unaware of why his hatred would be rekindled by my selection. I felt unsettled, threatened even, despite being several magnitudes stronger than this enraged man. Because, little brother, your father is also mine. He had his own family, while mine had literally fallen to ruin. I eventually came to know of you all, but couldn't bring myself to hate you or your brother. You were innocent in all of this. But when my daughter was passed over for you, for merely tutoring, I became livid, and all those rotten, horrible feelings came rushing back. So I called up a buddy at the mines who owed me a favor, and had him bring me this. He extended the jar a bit away from his chest, but held on securely, aware of my speed. I knew that they would have you on night patrol following the festival. It's what they give to everyone. So I simply waited for you to stop by. And sure enough, you did. His voice trailed off, leaving the atmosphere charged with animosity. I tried to read his thoughts, but all I received was a black and boiling anger. I had no idea what he was planning, but I didn't have to wait long to find out. I had been expecting him to reach for the jar's lid, but instead, he just dropped it. Since I hadn't anticipated that action, I wasn't immediately compelled to move. By the time that I did reach him, the jar was already shattering on the pavement, spilling the black dust everywhere. The man didn't move at that, and I softly, for my strength, pushed him away, sending him several feet back. The dust billowed into the air, and I inhaled some of it. Its effects were surprising, devastating. I immediately started to choke, as if the stuff was self-replicating within my body, filling my lungs. In addition to this respiratory disruption, my head started to burn, as if someone had ignited a torch within my skull, setting my brain aflame. The combined pain was debilitating. I fell to my knees, coughing and clutching my head, trying to expel the clogging substance from my lungs and relieve the intracranial heat with caresses on my scalp. Neither action helped. I heard the approaching footsteps of the man and felt a terror unlike anything I would have ever been able to imagine. I looked up and saw sheer, infernal hatred within his dark eyes. His face twisted into an almost demonic expression as he stared down at me. He watched me in my throes of agony for a second, and then knelt down so that his face was directly in front of mine. I saw the closest approximation of true evil in his face, a horror-inducing visage bereft of any humanity. He allowed himself a cruelly smug smile, and then put a gun to my stomach. The bullet's impact was barely felt with the other sources of pain assailing me, but I was nonetheless rocked backwards, landing roughly upon the pavement. He watched me for one last moment, and then entered his car and drove away. I had laid there for what seemed like hours before I heard these sirens of emergency vehicles. The next minutes and eventually hours of my life seemed to pass by as if played in a disordered and incomplete slideshow. I awoke in the one hospital of our town, hooked up to several machines, with a nurse fussing over me. The doctor entered soon after I regained complete consciousness and informed me of my condition. My powers had been stripped from me by the black powder, which was a sort of canceling agent meant for superheroes whose powers did not naturally diminish after the 1-year period. I was then shot once in the stomach and left for dead on the street. My family arrived not long after that. My brother entered crying, and my mother started up soon after seeing me. My father looked similarly pained, and I saw in his eyes that he had an idea of who my attacker had been. I glanced at him with an expression that said, "We need to talk," and did my best to assure my brother and mother that I would be alright. Thankfully, I was supported by the doctor in my then baseless self-assessment. I will recover, although I won't retain any of my powers. Those are completely gone. The police have been told the identity of the man who shot me, and are tirelessly searching for him within their means, but they suspect that he's fled town with his daughter and wife. There are also rumors that something trapped within the mines escaped simultaneously with my attack, something that had been locked away for years. I heard nurses whispering about it during a checkup, while I pretended to be asleep. From what I understand, this thing had been accidentally let loose, but one of the nurses couldn't see how that was possible, since the guard station which oversaw its captivity was manned 24/7. I then recalled how the man who shot me had said that he knew someone who worked within the mines that owed him a favor. I have no proof to draw a connection between what happened to me and what happened within the mine, but I feel like something terrible will soon happen, that some horror will soon beset our town, without a hero to defend it. In the meantime, while I recover, I plan to talk to my father and find out the full truth of his history with the man, my alleged older brother.